The meeting hall was enormous and filled with aliens from every corner of the galaxy. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the center of the circular room, wearing his best military uniform. Next to him stood Lieutenant Amy Carter, who carried a small computer device that contained all the information about Earth and humanity. They had traveled for 6 months through space to reach this place called the Galactic Assembly. This was where all the major alien species met to discuss important matters like trade and peace treaties and territorial boundaries. The building itself was made of some kind of crystal that seemed to glow from within, and the whole place felt ancient and powerful. Jake looked around at the hundreds of alien delegates sitting in their elevated seats surrounding him. Some looked like giant insects, while others resembled snakes or birds or things he could not even describe. They were all staring down at him and Amy with expressions that ranged from curiosity to what looked like amusement. He could hear them whispering to each other in their various languages, and the translation devices built into the hall converted their words into English for him to understand. Most of what he heard was not encouraging. A tall serpent-like creature raised one of its forearms to get attention. This was the ambassador from a species called the Velcros, and he seemed to be one of the more important members of the assembly. His scales shimmered with different colors as he spoke, and his voice came out smooth but cold. He looked at the documents that Amy had submitted about humanity, and then looked back at Jake with something that might have been a smile if snakes could smile. The Velcros ambassador spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber. He said that humanity wanted to join the Galactic Assembly, but that their technology was far too primitive for consideration. He pointed out that humans still use something called railguns, which were basically just chunks of metal shot at high speed using magnetic fields. He said this was the kind of weapon that advanced civilizations had abandoned thousands of years ago. The other delegates made sounds of agreement, and some even laughed at the idea of such outdated technology. Jake kept his face neutral even though he felt anger rising in his chest. He had expected some resistance, but not outright mockery. He tried to explain that human railguns were highly effective and that they had successfully defended human space from multiple attacks over the past 10 years. He mentioned that all the technical specifications had been included in their application, and that if the assembly would just review the data, they would see how capable human weapons actually were. Another alien spoke up, and this one looked like a giant praying mantis with golden armor plating. She was from a species called the Horthians, and she served as a military advisor to the assembly. She made a clicking sound with her mouth parts that the translator said was laughter. She told Jake that shooting metal projectiles at enemies was something her ancestors had done 10,000 years ago. She said that modern warfare was fought with plasma weapons and gravity beams and other energy-based systems. She explained that these weapons could be amplified and focused and modified in ways that simple kinetic projectiles could never match. Amy stepped forward and tried to add more information. She brought up holographic displays showing battle footage from human encounters with pirates and raiders. The images showed human ships firing their railguns and the devastating impact those weapons had on enemy vessels. She pointed out that in every engagement, the human forces had won decisively despite often being outnumbered. She tried to emphasize that effectiveness should matter more than how advanced something appeared on paper. The Velcros ambassador waved his hand dismissively. He said that the enemies humanity had faced were nothing more than scouts and small-time criminals. He brought up his own holographic display showing the territory controlled by something called the Kresh Empire. The map showed a massive section of the galaxy colored in red indicating Kresh control. The ambassador explained that the Kresh had the most advanced shield technology in known space. He said that their defensive barriers could absorb and dissipate energy attacks with ease. Then he looked directly at Jake and said that kinetic weapons like railguns would simply bounce off Kresh shields without causing any damage at all. Several other delegates spoke up to agree with this assessment. They said that humanity needed to go back home and develop proper weapons technology before they could be considered for membership in the assembly. One suggested that humans should return in perhaps 100 years or so, once they had caught up with the rest of galactic civilization. Another said that allowing primitive species into the assembly would lower the standards and reputation of the entire organization. The session ended with humanity's application being rejected and tabled for future consideration. Jake and Amy walked out of the Great Hall in silence. Their shuttle was waiting for them in the docking area, and they made their way through corridors filled with aliens who stared at them with either pity or contempt. Once they were safely inside, their small ship and the door had closed behind them. Amy finally let her frustration show. She threw her computer device onto a seat and said some very unprofessional things about the Velcros ambassador and the Horthian military advisor and the entire Galactic Assembly in general. Jake sat down heavily in the pilot's seat and began running through the pre-flight checklist. He understood Amy's anger because he felt it too. They had come here hoping to establish peaceful relations with the wider galactic community. They had been honest about their capabilities and had submitted all the requested documentation. And they had been laughed at and dismissed like children who did not understand how the adult world worked. It was insulting and frustrating and deeply unfair. But Jake also knew something that the Galactic Assembly did not know. Human railguns were not just simple chunks of metal shot at high speed. They were precisely engineered tungsten carbide penetrators with depleted uranium cores. They were accelerated to velocities that approached a significant fraction of light speed. Each projectile carried kinetic energy equivalent to a small nuclear explosion. And human targeting computers could calculate trajectories and lead times and impact points with accuracy that bordered on perfect. The weapons might look primitive to aliens who had forgotten the basics of physics, but they were absolutely devastating in actual combat. As their shuttle lifted off from the landing pad and began the journey back to human space, Jake looked over at Amy and allowed himself a small smile. He told her not to worry too much about the rejection. He said that everyone learned eventually, and that the galaxy would figure out soon enough that primitive did not mean ineffective. Amy asked him what he meant by that, and Jake just shook his head. He said that some lessons had to be learned the hard way, and that he had a feeling the Galactic Assembly was about to get a very expensive education in the realities of kinetic warfare. 8 months had passed since the humiliating rejection at the Galactic Assembly. Fleet Admiral Ryan Bennett stood on the command deck of the Earth Defense Force carrier named Valiant and studied the holographic display floating in front of him. The display showed the Kepler sector, which was a region of space rich in minerals and rare elements that human colonies needed for construction and manufacturing. For the past year, humanity had been running mining operations in this sector without any problems. The work had been going smoothly with automated drilling platforms extracting valuable resources and transport ships carrying them back to the colony worlds. Everything had been peaceful and productive until 3 days ago, when the sensors detected something approaching from deep space. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant sat at her station monitoring the incoming data feeds. She looked up at Admiral Bennett and reported that there were now 37 hostile ships entering the outer edge of the Kepler sector. The sensor readings identified them as belonging to the Kresh Empire, which was the same civilization that the Velcros ambassador had mentioned during the assembly meeting. Lisa explained that the fleet composition included 12 heavy cruisers and 20 destroyers and 5 massive dreadnought-class vessels. She added that the Kresh were broadcasting messages on all frequencies, demanding that humanity immediately cease all mining operations and evacuate the sector within 48 hours. Captain Greg Palmer, who served as the executive officer of the Valiant, stepped closer to examine the display. He pointed out that the Kepler sector was unclaimed space, and that no species, including the Kresh, had filed any territorial rights with the Galactic Assembly. This was clearly just a power play designed to test humanity and see if the newcomers would back down when faced with superior numbers. Greg said that the Kresh obviously believed the propaganda about human weapons being primitive and ineffective. They thought they could just roll in with an overwhelming force and push humanity around without facing any real resistance. Ryan nodded slowly as he processed all the information. He asked Lisa how many human ships were currently in the sector and available for combat operations. She checked her screens and reported that there were 15 ships total. The Valiant was the largest and most powerful, but the rest consisted of 6 destroyers and 8 frigates. Even counting every vessel, they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, and the Kresh ships were individually larger and supposedly better armed. On paper, it looked like a fight that humanity could not win. But Ryan had not become fleet admiral by following conventional thinking. He had studied every report from the Galactic Assembly and had read extensively about Kresh military tactics. The Kresh relied heavily on their shield technology and their plasma lance weapons. Their entire combat doctrine was built around the idea that their defenses were impenetrable and their firepower was overwhelming. They fought by simply advancing straight at their enemies and absorbing any attacks, while they fired back with devastating energy beams. It was a strategy that had worked for them for centuries because every other species in the galaxy used similar energy-based weapons. But humanity did not use energy weapons, and the Kresh were about to learn why that mattered. Ryan issued orders for all ships to prepare for combat using what he called Battle Protocol Theta. This was a specific tactical plan that human forces had developed for dealing with larger and more numerous enemy fleets. Lisa sent the encrypted commands to all the captains, and within minutes every human ship in the sector was moving into position. Ryan set the engagement time for 16 hours from now, which would give his forces time to complete their preparations and also allow the Kresh to move deeper into the sector where they would have less room to maneuver. On board the lead, Kresh Dreadnought Supreme Commander Zalthus sat on his command throne and watched the tactical displays with satisfaction. His intelligence reports had told him everything he needed to know about these primitive humans. They used magnetic accelerators to shoot solid projectiles at their enemies, which was laughably outdated technology. His shields were designed to absorb and dissipate massive amounts of energy, and while they had not been specifically tested against kinetic weapons, the science was clear. A solid object hitting an energy barrier would simply bounce off or break apart without causing any significant damage. The physics were straightforward and undeniable. Zalthus ordered his fleet to advance toward the mining facilities. His plan was to destroy the industrial equipment first and let the humans watch their investments burn. Then he would turn his attention to the human ships and obliterate them one by one. It would be a quick and decisive victory that would establish Kresh dominance in this region of space. Other species would see what happened here and would think twice before challenging Kresh territorial claims in the future. As the Kresh armada moved deeper into the Kepler sector, the human ships suddenly broke formation. They scattered in different directions, moving away from the mining facilities they were supposed to be defending. Zalthus watched this with growing satisfaction. The humans were panicking and running away just as he had expected. He ordered his ships to pursue and destroy them before they could escape the sector. His fleet accelerated forward, maintaining their tight formation, because their shields were strongest when the ships stayed close together and overlapped their defensive fields. Then the Valiant fired its main railgun. The projectile was a tungsten carbide penetrator weighing 2 tons and accelerated to 75,000 kilometers per second. At that velocity, the slug was effectively invisible, because it was moving far faster than any sensor or camera could track. The Kresh shields detected something approaching, but the defensive systems were calibrated for energy weapons that could be seen and measured and deflected. By the time the computers realized that a solid object was incoming, it was already too late to react. The railgun slug hit the first Kresh heavy cruiser and passed completely through it. The kinetic energy transfer was so massive that the ship's internal structures simply disintegrated. The fusion reactors lost containment and exploded, adding to the destruction. Within 2 seconds, the heavy cruiser had been reduced to an expanding cloud of debris and superheated gas. Zalthus stared at his display in shock, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. Before he could issue any orders, 3 more railgun rounds found their targets and 3 more Kresh ships came apart like toys being smashed by invisible hammers. The human ships were not running away at all. They had dispersed to create optimal firing solutions and to make themselves harder to target. Now they opened fire in earnest with every railgun they possessed. The destroyers and frigates were smaller than the Valiant, but their weapons were just as deadly. Each shot was carefully aimed at critical points on the Kresh vessels. The human targeting computers calculated trajectories accounting for relative velocities and distances, and the slight gravitational effects from nearby stellar bodies. Every calculation was perfect, and every shot hit exactly where it was supposed to hit. Zalthus screamed orders at his crew, telling them to activate evasive maneuvers and return fire. But the Kresh ships were huge lumbering vessels built for intimidation rather than agility. They had been designed under the assumption that their shields would protect them from any attack. Now those shields were proving completely useless against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The Kresh plasma lances fired back, but the human ships were much smaller and more maneuverable. They dodged between the energy beams while continuing to pour railgun fire into the Kresh formation. The battle lasted exactly 17 minutes from the first shot to the last. When it was over, 25 Kresh ships had been completely destroyed, and another 12 were badly damaged and fleeing the sector. Zalthus himself had survived only because his dreadnought had been positioned in the rear of the formation. He watched in horror as his fleet disintegrated around him and then ordered a full retreat. The remaining Kresh vessels turned and ran at maximum speed, desperate to escape before the humans could finish them off. Not a single human ship had been destroyed or even seriously damaged. It was the most one-sided military defeat in Kresh history, and the implications were staggering. 3 days after what was already being called the Kepler Massacre, the Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session. Ambassador Helen Foster represented humanity, this time standing in the exact same spot where Jake Morrison had stood 8 months earlier, when humanity's application for membership had been rejected. The atmosphere in the Great Crystalline Hall was completely different now. Instead of dismissive laughter and casual contempt, there was tension and fear. The alien delegates whispered among themselves and kept glancing at Helen with expressions that ranged from shock to barely concealed terror. The Velcros ambassador, who had been so confident and dismissive before now, looked visibly stressed. His scales had lost their shimmering quality and his movements were jerky and uncertain. He addressed Helen directly, saying that humanity had destroyed a Kresh military fleet consisting of 25 warships. He said that the Kresh Emperor was demanding reparations for the losses and threatening to launch a full-scale war against human space. His voice carried an edge of panic, as if he was trying to figure out how this situation had spiraled so completely out of control. Helen maintained a calm and professional demeanor, even though part of her wanted to point out the irony of the situation. She responded by stating the simple facts. The Kresh had entered space that was under human control and had issued an ultimatum demanding that humanity abandon legally established mining facilities. When humanity refused to comply with this illegal demand, the Kresh had advanced with obvious hostile intent. The human forces had defended their territory using appropriate force. Everything humanity had done was consistent with the right of self-defense that every species possessed. The Horthian delegate, whose mandibles had clicked with laughter 8 months ago, now trembled as she spoke. She said that what humanity had done should not have been possible. The Kresh shields were among the most advanced defensive systems in the galaxy. They had been tested against every known weapon type, and had proven effective at absorbing and dissipating energy attacks. Kinetic weapons were supposed to be useless against such shields. The physics should have prevented any solid projectile from penetrating an energy barrier. Yet somehow the human railguns had punched through the Kresh defenses as if they were not even there. Helen activated a holographic display that showed technical readouts and mathematical calculations. She explained in simple terms that the effectiveness of a weapon was not just about the delivery mechanism, but about the total energy involved. A railgun worked by accelerating a dense projectile to extremely high velocities using magnetic fields. The kinetic energy of an object was calculated by taking half the mass multiplied by the velocity squared. When you accelerated a 2-ton tungsten carbide slug to 75,000 kilometers per second, the kinetic energy became absolutely enormous. The impact delivered the equivalent of a 50-megaton explosion, concentrated into a space smaller than a fist. No energy shield in existence could dissipate that much energy that quickly. She went on to explain that energy shields worked by creating a field that absorbed incoming energy and spread it across a larger area over a longer period of time. This was effective against plasma weapons and lasers, because those attacks delivered their energy gradually over microseconds or even milliseconds. But a solid projectile delivered all its energy in a single instant. The shield tried to absorb the impact, but there was simply too much energy arriving too fast. The field collapsed and the projectile continued through to strike the hull. Once the hull was breached, the kinetic energy transferred into the ship's structure, causing catastrophic damage. The chamber fell silent as the delegates absorbed this information. It was clear that none of them had considered the mathematics involved. They had dismissed kinetic weapons as primitive, without doing the actual calculations to see what would happen when you accelerated a dense object to a significant fraction of light speed. Now they were facing the uncomfortable reality that their assumptions had been completely wrong. The Velcros ambassador spoke again, asking what humanity wanted. He said that the Kresh would not accept this defeat quietly. The Kresh Empire controlled hundreds of star systems and possessed over 1,500 warships. Even if human weapons were effective, the sheer numbers involved meant that any prolonged conflict would be devastating for both sides. He asked if humanity was prepared to face the full might of the Kresh military machine. Helen's expression hardened. She said that humanity did not want war, All they wanted was to be left alone to develop their colonies in peace. But if the Kresh insisted on conflict, then humanity would defend itself using every means available. She said that the 25 ships destroyed at Kepler were just a preview. If the Kresh sent their entire fleet against human space, they would discover that humanity had been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. Back on Earth in the underground command center beneath the city of Geneva, Fleet Admiral Ryan Bennett was briefing the Defense Council on military readiness. The Defense Council consisted of civilian leaders who oversaw the military and made decisions about when and how force should be used. Secretary of Defense Linda Murphy reviewed the latest intelligence reports showing Kresh fleet movements. She pointed out that the Kresh had over 1,500 warships spread across their empire. Even with humanity's technological advantage, those numbers represented a serious threat. Ryan agreed with her assessment, but said that humanity was not planning to fight the Kresh ship to ship. Instead, they would implement something called the Hawking Protocol, which was named after a famous Earth physicist. The protocol was a defensive strategy that humanity had developed specifically for dealing with numerically superior forces. It was brutal and efficient and would send an unmistakable message to every species in the galaxy that attacking humanity carried an unacceptable cost. Council Chairman Peter Ross asked if the Hawking Protocol was really necessary. He worried that using such an aggressive strategy might be seen as an escalation that would make the situation worse. He suggested that perhaps diplomacy could still resolve the crisis without further bloodshed. Several other council members nodded in agreement, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of deliberately destroying such a large enemy fleet. Ryan understood their concerns, but he also understood military reality. He explained that the Kresh Empire had been expanding through intimidation and overwhelming force for 3 centuries. They had conquered 14 different species and absorbed their territories. Their entire culture was built around the idea that might made right and that showing weakness invited attack. If humanity backed down now or showed any hesitation, every predatory species in the galaxy would see Earth as easy prey. The only way to ensure long-term peace was to demonstrate that attacking humans carried consequences so severe that no rational leader would take the risk. Linda Murphy asked how long they had before the Kresh fleet arrived. Ryan checked the latest reports from deep space monitoring stations. The sensors had detected large-scale fleet movements consistent with a major military offensive. Based on the distances involved and the known capabilities of Kresh engines, the best estimate was 6 weeks until enemy forces reached the Kepler sector. If the Kresh decided to push deeper into human space, it might take 3 months before they threatened Earth itself. That gave humanity time to prepare, but not much time. Peter looked around the table at his fellow council members. He asked if everyone understood what they were authorizing. The Hawking Protocol would result in massive Kresh casualties. Thousands of enemy personnel would die. This was not a decision to be made lightly, but it was also necessary to protect Earth and the 17 human colony worlds. He called for a vote on whether to authorize implementation of the Hawking Protocol. The vote was unanimous. Every council member voted yes despite their personal reservations. They understood that sometimes leaders had to make terrible decisions for the greater good. The defense of humanity required strength and resolve. If the Kresh wanted war, then they would get war, but it would be fought on humanity's terms using humanity's strategies. The galaxy was about to learn that underestimating humans was a fatal mistake. Emperor Krathak of the Kresh Empire stood before his war council, in a rage that made his attendants fear for their lives. The loss of 25 ships at Kepler was more than just a military setback. It was a humiliation that threatened his authority and made him look weak in front of the other noble houses. The Kresh culture valued strength above all else, and any leader who appeared weak would quickly find himself replaced by someone more capable. Krathak had ruled for 30 years through a combination of cunning and brutality, but now his position was being questioned because of these upstart humans and their primitive weapons. He demanded answers from his military commanders. Admiral Vexoth was the most senior officer present, and he bore the responsibility for planning the next phase of operations. Vexoth was a scarred veteran who had led 50 successful campaigns over his long career. He was known for his tactical brilliance and his absolute ruthlessness in combat. Now he stood before his emperor and promised that the humans would pay for their defiance. Vexoth explained that he had assembled a fleet of 1,200 warships. This represented nearly 80% of the entire Kresh military and was the largest armada that had been gathered in over a century. The fleet included 40 dreadnoughts, which were the most powerful ships in the Kresh arsenal. There were also 300 heavy cruisers and hundreds of destroyers and support vessels. The sheer mass of firepower involved was staggering. Vexoth said that they would sweep through human space like an unstoppable storm, destroying every colony and every outpost and every ship they encountered. By the time the campaign was over, humanity would be extinct and the galaxy would remember the price of challenging the Kresh Empire. Krathak asked when the fleet would be ready to depart. Vexoth replied that final preparations were already underway, and that they would launch within 1 week. The Emperor smiled for the first time since receiving news of the Kepler defeat. He told Vexoth to show no mercy, and to make an example of the humans that would terrify every other species in the galaxy. Vexoth bowed and promised that it would be done. What neither Krathak nor Vexoth knew was that humanity had been monitoring Kresh communications for months. Human intelligence services had broken the Kresh encryption codes and were reading their military transmissions in real time. Every fleet movement and every strategic discussion and every supply route was being cataloged and analyzed. By the time the Kresh armada actually departed, human forces knew exactly where they were going and when they would arrive. Admiral Ryan Bennett had used this information to plan his response down to the smallest detail. The Kresh armada emerged from compressed space at the edge of the Kepler sector, exactly when human intelligence had predicted. The 1,200 ships arranged themselves in a massive battle formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers. Admiral Vexoth expected to find the human fleet waiting to defend the mining facilities. His plan was to engage them directly and use his overwhelming numbers to crush any resistance. But when his sensors swept the sector, they found almost nothing. The mining facilities were abandoned and there were no human warships in sight. Only a single destroyer remained floating near the center of the sector. The lone human destroyer was broadcasting a message on repeat. The message warned that Kresh vessels were entering human-controlled space and should turn back immediately or face severe consequences. Vexoth laughed at this. One destroyer was threatening 1,200 warships. The humans had clearly gone insane. He ordered his entire fleet to advance and destroy the impudent vessel. The Kresh armada moved forward in their tight formation, with their shields overlapping to provide maximum protection. The human destroyer began to accelerate away from the approaching fleet. It was faster than the Kresh ships and easily stayed ahead of them. Vexoth ordered pursuit, assuming that the humans were simply running scared. His fleet chased the destroyer deeper into the sector. What Vexoth did not realize was that he was being led into a carefully prepared kill zone. The sector was not empty at all. It was filled with hundreds of objects that his sensors had dismissed as asteroids or debris. Now those objects suddenly activated their engines and revealed their true nature. The objects were weapons platforms. Each platform was essentially a massive railgun mounted on a simple maneuvering frame. There was minimal crew space because these platforms were designed to be operated by just 2 or 3 people. There was no armor or fancy shields or comfortable living quarters. Every bit of mass and every component was dedicated to a single purpose, which was delivering devastating kinetic strikes at long range. The platforms had been positioned throughout the sector over the past 6 weeks while the Kresh fleet was being assembled. Now they were in perfect position to execute the Hawking Protocol. Admiral Ryan Bennett watched from the Valiant, which was positioned safely outside the engagement zone. He opened a communications channel to all the weapons platforms. His voice was calm and professional as he gave the order. He said that all platforms were weapons-free and authorized to execute the Hawking Protocol. Within seconds, 200 railguns began firing simultaneously. The first volley crossed the distance to the Kresh fleet in less than 3 seconds. Each platform had been assigned specific targets based on detailed computer calculations. The targeting solution accounted for the relative velocities of both the platforms and the Kresh ships. It factored in gravitational effects and the slight delay between firing and impact. Every single shot was placed with surgical precision. Over 300 Kresh ships simply disintegrated as railgun slugs tore through them. The tightly packed formation that had seemed so powerful now worked against them, because destroyed ships collided with neighboring vessels, causing cascading failures. Admiral Vexoth screamed orders, trying desperately to organize some kind of response. But the weapons platforms were designed specifically for this kind of engagement. They did not need to worry about crew comfort or long-term survival. They could absorb damage and continue fighting as long as their railguns remained functional. The platforms were also equipped with the same advanced targeting computers as regular human warships. Those computers could track every vessel in the Kresh fleet and calculate firing solutions faster than any organic crew could react. The second volley fired 8 seconds after the first. Another 200 railgun slugs screamed across space and another 200 Kresh ships died. Vexoth tried to order his fleet to scatter and break formation, but the Kresh vessels were too large and too slow. They had been built for intimidation rather than maneuverability. Now that design choice was proving fatal. The third volley specifically targeted the 40 dreadnoughts. These massive ships were the pride of the Kresh fleet, and each one carried enough firepower to level a planet. But size made them easy targets. Multiple railgun rounds hit each dreadnought within milliseconds of each other. The kinetic energy transfers were so massive that the ships simply came apart. The Kresh fleet finally managed to return fire. Plasma lances and particle beams lashed out at the weapons platforms. Some platforms were destroyed, but most survived because they were small and difficult to target accurately. The ones that were hit often continued firing until their final systems failed. The fourth volley eliminated most of the remaining heavy cruisers. The fifth volley targeted the destroyers that were trying to flee. By now, the Kresh formation had completely dissolved into chaos. Individual ships were trying to escape in every direction, but the weapons platforms tracked them all. The targeting computers calculated lead times and trajectories, and the railguns fired with mechanical precision. The battle lasted 40 minutes from first shot to last. When it finally ended, the Kresh armada had been reduced to fewer than 100 damaged vessels. Over 1,100 ships had been destroyed. Nearly 2 million Kresh personnel were dead. It was the worst military disaster in the recorded history of the galaxy. Admiral Vexoth himself died when his flagship took 3 direct hits and lost all power. The few surviving ships that managed to escape carried word of the massacre back to Kresh space. The Hawking Protocol had worked exactly as designed and had sent an unmistakable message to every species in the galaxy. The Galactic Assembly Chamber was completely silent as Ambassador Helen Foster presented the battle data from the Kresh fleet engagement. Holographic projections showed the destruction in clinical detail. The delegates watched as 1,200 ships entered the Kepler sector, and then watched as weapons platforms systematically tore the armada apart. The footage showed Kresh vessels disintegrating under railgun impacts. It showed the cascading failures as damaged ships collided with their neighbors. It showed the desperate attempts to flee and the precise targeting that hunted down even the scattered survivors. When the presentation ended, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. The Velcros ambassador finally broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said that everything had changed. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a way that nobody had anticipated. A species that had been dismissed as primitive just months ago had now demonstrated the ability to destroy any fleet that opposed them. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Helen allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before responding. She said that humanity had not sought this conflict. They had applied for membership in the Assembly peacefully. They had submitted all required documentation, including technical specifications of their weapon systems. They had been rejected because their technology was deemed primitive. Then the Kresh had attacked, believing that humans were weak and easy prey. The Kresh had learned otherwise at great cost. Helen said that humanity bore no guilt for defending their sovereign territory against an invasion force. The Horthian delegate spoke up with her mandibles trembling. She said that the Kresh Emperor was demanding that the Assembly formally condemn humanity's actions. The Emperor claimed that using automated weapons platforms violated the established laws of warfare. He was calling for economic sanctions and military intervention to punish humanity for what he described as war crimes. Helen's expression hardened as she responded. She pointed out that the laws of war only applied to member species of the Galactic Assembly. Humanity was not a member, as the delegates had made very clear 8 months ago. Therefore, humanity was not bound by Assembly regulations. She said that humans had used whatever means necessary to defend themselves against an invasion force that outnumbered them 12-1. If the Assembly wanted humanity to follow its rules, then perhaps the Assembly should reconsider the membership application that had been so casually rejected. The Zenithar Consortium representative spoke next. This being was composed of pure energy, contained within a crystalline matrix, and its translated voice carried a sense of urgency. It said that the other species of the galaxy were terrified. Humanity had demonstrated the ability to destroy any military force through the use of kinetic weapons that nobody had properly understood. Now there were demands for restrictions on human weapons production. Some species wanted mandatory inspections of human military facilities. Others were calling for strict limits on human territorial expansion. The fear was that if humanity continued to grow unchecked, they might eventually threaten everyone. Helen took a deep breath before responding to these concerns. She said that humanity would absolutely not accept restrictions on their defensive capabilities. They would not allow foreign inspections of military installations, and they would continue to expand into unclaimed space as they saw fit. However, she said that humanity was willing to offer a compromise. She activated a new holographic display that showed a detailed star map. The map showed human-controlled space highlighted in blue. It included Earth and the 17 colony worlds plus a buffer zone around each settlement. Helen explained that these were humanity's current territorial claims. She proposed that humanity would not expand beyond these boundaries for the next 50 years. This would give the other species time to adjust to human presence and would prevent any conflicts over disputed territory. In exchange, humanity wanted full membership in the Galactic Assembly, with all associated rights and protections. They wanted mutual defense treaties with any species interested in peaceful relations. And most importantly, they wanted respect. The chamber erupted in debate. Some delegates argued for accepting humanity's proposal immediately before the situation got worse. Others insisted that more restrictions were needed. A few suggested that the Assembly should try to negotiate humanity into accepting weaker terms. The Velcros ambassador eventually called for order, and then called for a vote. He pointed out that the alternative to accepting humanity's proposal was allowing an unregulated military power to operate without any oversight whatsoever. At least membership would bring humans under Assembly jurisdiction and create channels for diplomatic resolution of future disputes. The vote took several hours as delegates consulted with their home governments. In the end, 312 species voted to accept humanity's terms. 47 voted against and 41 abstained. It was not an overwhelming mandate, but it was enough. Ambassador Helen Foster became the official representative of humanity to the Galactic Assembly. The Earth Defense Force received recognition as a legitimate military organization under galactic law. Humanity had achieved in violence what they could not achieve through peaceful application. But the real changes happened over the weeks and months that followed. The Kresh Empire sued for peace within days of the vote. Emperor Krathak was overthrown by his own nobles who blamed him for the disastrous losses. The new government immediately opened negotiations with humanity and signed a comprehensive non-aggression treaty. The treaty recognized all human territorial claims and established trade agreements that would benefit both species. The Kresh also agreed to pay reparations for the initial attack on the Kepler mining facilities. 6 species that had been conquered by the Kresh over the previous 2 centuries declared independence. Without their military power, the Kresh could not hold their empire together. Several of these newly independent species approached humanity asking for assistance. Earth provided military training and shared some defensive technologies. Human advisors helped these species establish their own defense forces and taught them how to protect themselves from future aggression. The Zenithar Consortium proposed a joint research initiative with humanity. They wanted to study the principles behind kinetic weapons and see if similar approaches could be applied to other areas of technology. Admiral Ryan Bennett, who had been promoted to Supreme Commander of all Earth Defense Forces, personally oversaw this collaboration. The research led to breakthroughs in propulsion systems and energy generation that benefited both humans and the consortium. Most significantly, over 50 species approached humanity to establish formal diplomatic relations. Trade agreements were signed bringing new goods and technologies to human worlds. Cultural exchange programs allowed humans to learn about alien civilizations while aliens learned about Earth. Military alliances were formed with species who wanted the protection that came from association with human forces. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about underestimating primitive technology. On Earth, in her office overlooking Lake Geneva, Secretary of Defense Linda Murphy reviewed reports from the Assembly. The transition from isolated newcomers to recognized galactic power had happened faster than anyone had anticipated. There had been costs, including the thousands of Kresh dead and the diplomatic tensions that still simmered. But humanity had secured its place among the stars and had done so on its own terms. Her assistant Daniel Wright entered with the latest dispatches. He reported that the Velcros had sent a formal apology for their initial dismissal of humanity's membership application. They were now requesting a state visit to discuss long-term cooperation. Daniel said that the Velcros specifically wanted to tour one of the weapons platforms. They wanted to understand exactly what kind of technology they were dealing with. Linda smiled and told Daniel to schedule the visit for next month. She also instructed him to make sure Admiral Ryan Bennett would be available for the tour. The Velcros needed to see the weapons platforms up close and understand that human military power was not just about the railguns themselves. It was about the integrated systems and the tactical doctrine and the willingness to use overwhelming force when necessary. Daniel mentioned one more thing before leaving. Ambassador Helen Foster had sent a personal message saying that the galaxy had finally gotten the message. Linda looked out at the peaceful lake and thought about everything that had changed. Humanity had reached for the stars hoping to find friends among the galactic community. Instead, they had found dismissal and contempt and war, but they had proven themselves through strength and determination. They had shown that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Captain Jake Morrison now commanded a destroyer called Endeavor. He sat in his ready room reviewing training protocols for the next generation of officers. His ship was part of a new class incorporating technologies learned from allied species. Commander Amy Carter served as his executive officer, and together they were preparing the crew for whatever challenges lay ahead. Amy commented on how much had changed since they stood before the assembly. Jake agreed, saying that they had been asking for permission to be taken seriously.